I think it should be challenged. And so we have, under the Biden administration, I sent criminal referrals for Anthony Fauci to Merrick Garland twice, and I sent them evidence that he had lied to Congress, which was a felony. They just ignored me. I've been working with Bobby Kennedy, and he's been very helpful on this. I have a good relationship with him. He's given us a lot of information, and we've looked at the communications. And in Anthony Fauci's communications, we now have evidence that he was telling people like Francis Collins, read this and destroy it.
So Joe Rogan just dropped bombshell revelations about Anthony Fauci facing criminal referrals for lying to Congress and destroying federal records. We're talking evidence of read this and destroy it communications during COVID. This goes way beyond policy disagreements. This is potential felony territory that two administrations have ignored.
Well, you can't do that. The executive branch, when they communicate, they're required to keep their communications, and they're required to do it on government devices. So we have this evidence, and I've summarized it again in a criminal referral to Trump's attorney general, and I still haven't gotten action. But there's a couple reasons we should do it. One, he shouldn't get away with lying. He shouldn't get away with destroying records. But two, we should check the pardon. Is an auto pen pardon valid? And is a pardon a retrospective pardon back 10 years that doesn't mention a crime? Can you give people a pardon for everything they did in a 10-year period? I can't imagine, and I think the court might narrow that. But it doesn't happen unless the Trump Justice Department will do something.
The blanket pardon issue here is massive. Biden gave Fauci a retroactive 10-year pardon for unspecified crimes using an auto pen signature. Legal scholars are already questioning whether courts will uphold such broad, non-specific pardons. If Trump's DOJ challenges this successfully, it could set precedent limiting presidential pardon power forever.
We all knew he was lying and he was parsing words. He was trying to have a semantics type of argument. But one of the reasons we know he's lying, and one of the things that I presented as evidence, is there was a group text chain on February 1st of 2020. So you have all these virologists who are saying privately it came from the lab and publicly it didn't. You have them all communicating. But one of the things Anthony Fauci says about the Wuhan lab is, he says, we know it's dangerous and possible because we know they're doing gain-of-function research. So we're funding them. He would never admit we're funding him because we were funding EcoHealth, right, this intermediary. So he said, we're not funding them. Well, we're funding them through EcoHealth. It's not gain-of-function, except for then he says the experiments they're doing are gain-of-function.
That February 1st, 2020 group text is the smoking gun. Virologists privately acknowledged lab origin while publicly denying it. The EcoHealth funding mechanism was deliberately designed to create plausible deniability. We fund EcoHealth, EcoHealth funds Wuhan, therefore we're not funding gain-of-function research. Classic bureaucratic shell game to avoid accountability.
He denied that natural immunity would protect you. And one of my favorite quotes was from a guy named Martin Kulldorff. He was an epidemiologist at Harvard who ended up getting fired. But recently he tweeted out, as about a year or two ago, he said, well, we knew about natural immunity from the time of the Athenian plague in 436 BC, and we knew that knowledge until 2020, and then we lost all knowledge of natural immunity. But the good news is in 2025, we're starting to get back that knowledge. But this was, Anthony Fauci knew better. You know, he couldn't even read his own basic immunology books about, the fact that you do develop immunity. Is it perfect? No. Can you get COVID more than once? Yes. But I defy you to tell me somebody who got it the second time who died the second time.
Martin Kulldorff's Harvard firing perfectly illustrates the scientific censorship campaign. This is a world-renowned epidemiologist who co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, and he gets fired for following actual science. His joke about losing 2,400 years of immunity knowledge in 2020 isn't really a joke at all.
And I had a friend whose life was saved. He didn't lose any of his limbs, and he had this terrible illness. And so I asked Anthony Fauci, I said, do you think there's a chance, as they're getting very, very sick and their lungs are filling up with fluid, that we could try high-dose IV steroids like we do in other infections? And he said, oh, no, we've tried that. Turns out, and we mentioned this in the book, the best treatment when you are just about to go on the ventilator or on the ventilator, when you have a 50% chance of dying at that point, was IV steroids, an old generic medicine that Big Pharma doesn't make much money off of.
Which steroids in particular were they using?
It's called Solumedrol, but it's just IV steroids. And it was a 36% reduction in death, which is pretty significant when you're in the ICU. The people in the ICU were very, very sick. It was a third of them had a reduction in death by taking IV steroids. But he was dismissing it from the very beginning and already acting like, oh, I know it's not going to work, and we're going to try remdesivir, which turned out not to work very well.
This is crucial because he's speaking as a practicing physician, not a politician. The dexamethasone study showed 36% mortality reduction for ICU patients. That's enormous in medicine. Meanwhile, remdesivir caused kidney failure and showed minimal benefit. Fauci dismissed proven treatments while pushing profitable but harmful drugs.
He says, take them down, talking about Jay Bhattacharya, the head of the NIH now, talking about Martin Kulldorff, and then an epidemiologist from Oxford. Take them down. And so when I have scientists come before my committee, I'll ask them the first question, have you ever or would you ever send another scientist a note saying to take down a fellow scientist you disagreed with? My goodness, what kind? That sounds like the mafia or something.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like someone who's supposed to be above the fray, objective scientist.
Francis Collins telling Fauci to take down respected scientists is pure academic thuggery. Jay Bhattacharya, who's now running NIH under Trump, was specifically targeted for supporting the Great Barrington Declaration. These weren't fringe conspiracy theorists. These were Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford epidemiologists being silenced for following data.
Well, the belief in the vaccines and the belief that you should do it was like a religious belief, and that's the way they treated it. So if you didn't believe in it, you were someone to be demonized as a non-believer. You were to be cast out, and you weren't patriotic if you weren't wearing a mask. And even after I've already had it, I'm walking down the hallway, between the office buildings and the Capitol, and all those reporters, they're 22 years old. Most of them are journalist majors. They never had a science course in their life, and they're lecturing me about why I should be wearing a mask. And it's like, I already had the disease. I've healed up 3 weeks. I don't need to wear a mask. I've got immunity.
He's absolutely right about the religious zealotry aspect. Young journalists with zero scientific training lecturing a physician senator about mask mandates after he'd already had COVID demonstrates how ideology completely replaced scientific reasoning. The cult-like enforcement of COVID orthodoxy destroyed public trust in institutions permanently.
She goes to the hospital, and they bring her family in. They're talking to her daughter, who's 85, says, we don't think your mom's going to make it. And she said, have you met my mom? And they said, well, and she survived. But while she was there, they decided to test her for antibodies to the Spanish flu because when she was 6 months old, her mother was coming across the Atlantic. Her mom died from the Spanish flu. She got it, survived. They tested her 100 years later. She still had antibodies to the Spanish flu. So immunity lasts a long damn time.
That Spanish flu story destroys Fauci's narrative about waning immunity. 100 years of detectable antibodies proves natural immunity's durability. Yet Fauci claimed natural immunity was short-lived and inferior to vaccines. This wasn't scientific ignorance. This was deliberate misinformation to protect vaccine market share.
Pharma. So what I ask is, if you're on the vaccine committee and you're going to recommend that every child get a COVID vaccine, shouldn't you have to release whether you get royalties, from Big Pharma? And Anthony Fauci in committee said, we don't have to do it. The law, and he quoted the law, says we don't have to do it. So for 2, 3, 4 years now, I'm still trying to get this passed. I've gotten all the Republicans to agree to it, and I've gotten all the Democrats but 2 or 3, and I'm still trying to get it passed unanimously. But it would say if you're a government scientist and you get royalties from Pfizer or from one of the big companies, you have to actually list it on a form, and really you should be then recused from voting.
Yeah, well, also, why are doctors allowed to be financially incentivized?
Yeah, that should be considered to be unethical or inappropriate. We did change some of the things with pharma and gifts to doctors about 10 years ago. It is better than it used to be as far as gifts to doctors, except for then they don't call this a gift. I think this should be under the gift ban. You should not be getting paid to use choose certain things. Because I think it's actually malpractice to give children the COVID vaccine.
The financial conflicts here represent legalized corruption. Government scientists receiving pharmaceutical royalties while making vaccine recommendations for children is textbook regulatory capture. The fact that Democrats are blocking disclosure requirements shows they're protecting this corrupt system. Children are being harmed for profit.
We think he needs to come in one more time, and I have asked him to come in voluntarily for testimony. We're negotiating with his attorneys. If he comes in voluntarily, we can get him to testify. If he resists, I have subpoena power, but it would probably require a court case to get him to come in. But I think he needs to fully explain why this wasn't gain of function and why he was destroying federal records.
Oh, what was the destroying of federal records?
Emails back and forth saying destroy this after you've read it. That's illegal, and we have evidence of.
With Trump back in office and RFK Jr. at HHS, Fauci's lawyer negotiations suggest he knows criminal exposure is real. The destroy after reading evidence could constitute obstruction of justice and destruction of federal records. After years of protection, accountability may finally be coming.